Tonight, wherever you are sitting, you are the only kind of human being on this entire planet. Say that out loud, and it sounds like a throwaway line. It is not. For almost the whole existence of our genus, that sentence would have been false. Somewhere on Earth right now, there should be someone built differently than you, thinking in a different rhythm, burying their dead a different way. There is not, and nobody agreed to that. Biologists have a word for what a healthy, successful genus usually looks like: crowded. Foxes, bears, cats, they all come in multiple overlapping species, often sharing the same forest in the same decade. Homo used to work the same way. At least 9 separate human species are now confirmed by fossils, stone tools, or DNA pulled out of 30,000-year-old dirt. 9. We tend to act like we were always the only ones in the room. Rewind the clock 40,000 years, not far in geological terms. Closer to us than the pyramids are to Julius Caesar, and the picture gets strange fast. On one continent, you might have crossed paths with 3 or 4 different kinds of human in a single lifetime. A short, heavy-boned cousin tending a fire nearby. A tall relative with a brow ridge like a shelf. Something smaller still, tucked onto an island, barely reaching your chest. Then, one by one, the room emptied. Nobody wrote down what happened, because the people it happened to left no writing behind, and the ones who survived were not taking careful notes on their neighbors going extinct. What is left is scattered. A cave floor in Siberia, a jawbone on a plateau in Tibet, footprints pressed into ash in Tanzania. Fragments. This film is going to try to build a body out of those fragments. Here is the honest version of the premise. This is not a tidy march from ape to man, chest out, spear raised, arrow pointing confidently forward, the poster you have seen in 100 textbooks. That poster is wrong, and everyone who studies this seriously will tell you so. The truth looks more like a thicket with dozens of branches, most of them snapped off, dead ends, entire populations that lived, adapted, and simply stopped. So let us name a few of those dead ends now, before we have earned the right to mourn them properly. Homo erectus, who left Africa 1 million years before anyone thought possible. Homo floresiensis, barely a meter tall, isolated on an Indonesian island for hundreds of thousands of years. Homo naledi, small-brained, found deep in a South African cave in a place that looks uncomfortably like a grave. Neanderthals, Denisovans, a species we know almost entirely from a finger bone. Every one of those names gets its own chapter, its own evidence, its own argument among scientists who have spent careers on a single scrap of jaw. For now, just sit with the shape of the mystery. Somewhere between 7 million years ago, when our lineage first split from the ancestors of chimpanzees, and about 40,000 years ago, the last time we shared a continent with another kind of human, this genus went from crowded to empty. That is not a footnote to the story of human evolution. That is the story. Everything else, the tools, the fire, the art on cave walls, the language, all of it happened inside that larger fact. For millions of years, being human meant sharing the world with other humans who were not us. They did not. There are 3 honest possibilities for why we are alone, and this film will not pretend the science has settled on one. Maybe it was climate, brutal and indifferent, closing doors faster than some species could adapt. Maybe it was disease, crossing a boundary between populations that had never needed immunity to each other. Or maybe, and this is the one that sits worst, it was us. Not metaphorically, not in some poetic sense about progress having a cost. Literally us, Homo sapiens, arriving in valleys and river systems where someone else was already living, and within a few thousand years, in place after place, being the only ones left standing. We will follow that thread all the way to the end of this film, and we will not rush past the parts that are uncomfortable to look at. But before any of that, before fire, before tools, before anyone could be blamed for anything, there is a much older question waiting. Somewhere in Central Africa, deep enough in time that the continents look slightly different on a map, a single population of apes split into 2. One branch eventually became chimpanzees and bonobos. The other became every human species this film is about to introduce you to, including the 8 that did not make it. No fossil marks that exact moment. No skeleton comes with a little flag on it reading, "Here, this is where it happened." We only know it happened because our DNA, and there's compared side by side today, run the clock backward and land on roughly the same number again and again, no matter which lab does the counting. For what it is worth, I have read the papers on this more times than is probably healthy, and the thing that gets me is not any single fossil. It is the ratio. 9 species, 1 left. Try that math on any other successful genus of large mammal, and it should worry you a little. Most of what remains of those other 8 species could fit, physically, inside a few dozen storage drawers in a handful of museums around the world. Boxes of bone fragments, cataloged, numbered, some smaller than a house key. That is the entire physical residue of populations that once numbered in the tens of thousands, spread across continents, alive for longer than Homo sapiens has existed so far. Over the next 19 chapters, we're going to meet every one of them properly, not as a checklist and not as a eulogy written in advance. We're going to walk the timeline in order from the split no fossil recorded, through the ones who left Africa first, through the strange island dwarves and the cave-dwelling ritual keepers, all the way to the 2 closest cousins we ever had and what actually happened when we met them. It starts earlier than any of that. It starts with an ape in a forest that does not exist anymore, doing something no other ape had done before, and not knowing it mattered. Part of what makes this hard to talk about cleanly is that the word species itself gets slippery this deep in the past. In the world you live in, species are usually easy to tell apart. A fox is not a wolf. A chimpanzee is not a gorilla. Go back a few million years into a thicket of hominins that could sometimes still produce children together across what we now call separate species, and the boundaries blur in ways that make tidy family trees almost a comforting lie. None of this happens in a vacuum, either. Every date, every branch, every claim in this film rests on methods that took decades to build. Radiocarbon dating for anything under about 50,000 years old, uranium, thorium, and potassium-argon dating for the much older layers, and more recently, the ability to pull usable genetic material out of bone that has been sitting in the ground for tens of thousands of years. That last one, ancient DNA, is barely 20 years old as a workable science, and it has already rewritten half of what this film is about to tell you. So when this film gives you a number, a date, a percentage, understand that it usually represents a current best estimate, not a fact carved in stone. Some of these numbers will shift again in the years after this documentary is finished. That is not a weakness of the science. That is what the science actually looks like while it is happening in real time, argued over by people who have devoted entire careers to a single skull. Keep all of that in mind as this film moves forward, because it is going to ask you to sit with uncertainty more often than most documentaries about this subject are willing to. That is deliberate. The version of this story with all the doubts sanded off is not the honest version, and it is the honest version that actually earns the dread this subject deserves. There is no photograph of the day humans stopped being apes, because there was no single day. Somewhere in Central Africa, around 7 million years ago, a population of primates began to split into 2 separate futures, and nothing about that moment looked dramatic enough to notice. No lightning, no transformation, just small differences accumulating generation after generation until the 2 groups could no longer be called the same thing. The way scientists know this happened at all is almost stranger than the event itself. It is called the molecular clock. Compare the DNA of a living human to the DNA of a living chimpanzee. Count the differences, and because mutations accumulate at a roughly steady rate over time, you can run the tape backward and estimate when the 2 lines diverged. Do the math, and you land, again and again, somewhere between 6 and 7 million years ago. Humans and chimpanzees share somewhere around 98% of their DNA. Sit with that number for a second. 2% separates you from an animal that cannot speak, cannot ask a question, cannot look at a photograph and understand what it is looking at. 2% built language, cities, and the ability to stand here and wonder about all of it. In 2001, in the Jebel Desert of northern Chad, a fossil hunting team led by Michel Brunet found a skull half buried in wind-blown sand, crushed almost flat by millions of years of pressure. They nicknamed it Tumai, a local Goran word roughly meaning hope of life, traditionally given to children born just before the harsh dry season. Nobody expected it to become one of the most argued over skulls in the history of the field. Sahelanthropus cadensis, as it was formally named, is somewhere between 6 and 7 million years old, right at the estimated split with chimpanzees. The skull is small, roughly chimpanzee-sized, with a heavy brow ridge sitting over the eyes. But the detail that set off the argument sits underneath at the base of the skull, where the spinal cord connects. In an animal that walks on all fours, that opening sits toward the back of the skull, angled to support a head hanging forward. In something walking upright, it shifts toward the center, positioned to balance a head resting directly on top of the spine. Brunet's team argued Tumai's opening looked closer to the upright version. If they are right, something was already standing on 2 legs nearly 7 million years ago, almost immediately after the split. Not everyone agreed, and the disagreement got personal fast. Critics pointed out the skull was so badly crushed and distorted by geological pressure that measuring the exact angle of anything on it is closer to guesswork than measurement. Some researchers went further, suggesting Tumai was not an early human relative at all, just an ordinary ancient ape, and that Brunet's team wanted a headline more than they wanted caution. Tumai is not the only candidate from this window, either. In Kenya, a fossil dated to around 6 million years old earned the nickname Millennium Man, formerly Ororhyntogenensis, with thigh bone anatomy that also hints at upright walking. In Ethiopia, an even older set of teeth and bone fragments, Ardipithecus cadaba, dated to nearly 6 million years, adds a third name to a very short, very contested list. Here is the uncomfortable truth underneath all of it. We do not actually know which of these, if any, is a direct ancestor of modern humans. Any one of them could be. All of them could be dead ends, side branches that walked upright, tried out bipedalism as an experiment, and then vanished without leaving descendants that survived to today. This is where the phrase missing link needs to be retired for good. It suggests a single connector, one fossil that would complete the chain if we just kept digging. That is not how it worked. There was no chain. There was a bush with dozens of branches sprouting out of roughly the same window of time, most of them pruned by extinction long before anyone was around to name them. What we can say with real confidence is narrower and in some ways stranger. Somewhere in this 7 million year old window, in a landscape of mixed forest and open ground in Central and East Africa, at least one population of apes began experimenting with walking on 2 legs instead of 4. We do not know why. We do not know exactly who did it first. We know it happened because it is the one trait every candidate from this era seems to share. I find something almost funny in a bleak way about how this chapter of the story actually starts. Not with a triumphant leap forward, but with a crushed, disputed skull in a desert, 3 rival candidates that might all be wrong, in a room full of extremely credentialed scientists who have spent decades arguing about the angle of a hole in the base of someone's head. But the argument matters because everything downstream of this moment depends on it. If walking upright really did begin this early, almost the instant the chimpanzee and human line separated, then bipedalism is not some later refinement layered onto an already successful ape. It is close to the founding decision of our entire lineage, the trait that everything else eventually got built on top of. It helps to understand why East Africa keeps producing these fossils in the first place, because it is not simply that early hominins only lived there. The Great Rift Valley is a tectonically active seam running down the continent, and volcanic eruptions along it repeatedly buried the landscape in layers of ash. That ash does 2 things at once. It preserves bone that would otherwise rot away within a few decades, and it gives geologists a datable layer sandwiched directly above and below whatever fossil turns up inside it. Outside conditions like that, fossilization almost never happens. The overwhelming majority of every creature that has ever lived left nothing behind at all. Skin, muscle, and organs rot within weeks. Bone itself needs to be buried quickly in the right kind of sediment, under the right chemical conditions, or it dissolves and scatters long before it has any chance of turning to stone. Every hominin fossil in a museum case represents an almost absurd stroke of geological luck. Which means the fossils this film is built on are not a representative sample of everyone who ever lived. They're a handful of extraordinarily lucky exceptions, pulled from populations that may have numbered in the tens of thousands, scattered across a continent, most of whom left no trace of themselves at all beyond whatever DNA still threads through the people descended from them. So every name in this film, Tumai, and every name still to come, needs an asterisk attached to it. Not the founder of humanity, not necessarily even a direct ancestor, just one lucky skeleton out of an uncountable number that never survived to be found, standing in for a much larger, much messier story that no single fossil could ever tell on its own. In 1978, in what is now Tanzania, Mary Leakey's team found something no fossil bone could ever show them directly. Not a skeleton, a trail, pressed into a layer of volcanic ash that had gone soft in the rain and then hardened like concrete. Two individuals had walked side by side, roughly 3.6 million years ago, leaving footprints so clear you can still see the arch, the heel strike, the big toe pointed forward instead of splayed out to the side like an ape's. Those footprints are still the oldest direct physical evidence of a hominin walking the way you walk. Not climbing, not knuckle-dragging, walking. And they arrive already looking finished. A fully formed human gait almost 3.5 million years before anything resembling a modern human skeleton existed. Whatever experiment started this, it had already been running for a long time by the point these two individuals crossed that ash field. To understand how long, go back further to a skeleton that took 15 years to properly describe. In 1994, in Ethiopia, researchers began uncovering the remains of Ardipithecus ramidus, nicknamed Ardi, dated to about 4.4 million years old. It took until 2009 for the full analysis to be published, because the bones were so fragile that some of them had to be excavated a few millimeters at a time over multiple field seasons just to keep them from crumbling. What Ardi showed broke a story scientists have been telling for decades. The old idea, sometimes called the savanna hypothesis, held that our ancestors were forced onto two legs when forests dried up into open grassland, standing tall to see over the grass and free their hands to carry things. Ardi did not live on open grassland. Ardi lived in a wooded, mixed environment with real tree cover and was already showing signs of walking upright anyway. Ardi's body is a strange, split-screen kind of fossil. The pelvis is shaped in a way that supports upright walking on the ground. But the feet still have a divergent, grasping big toe built for climbing through branches, not sprinting across open terrain. This was not a finished product. This was a population hedging its bets, keeping one foot quite literally in the trees while testing out life on the ground. So if it was not about seeing over tall grass, why walk upright at all? The honest answer is that nobody fully agrees. Some researchers point to efficiency. Upright walking uses less energy over long distances than a chimpanzee's bent-legged shuffle. Others point to freed hands, able to carry food, or infants, or eventually tools. Whatever the reason, the fossil record makes one thing clear. It happened slowly, awkwardly, in the trees as much as on the ground, long before anyone needed to explain it to a textbook. And it was not free. This is the part documentaries about human origins tend to skip past, because it does not flatter the story. Walking upright required narrowing the pelvis to keep the hip joints stacked efficiently under the body's center of gravity. Around the same evolutionary window, Hominin brains were on a long trajectory toward getting much, much larger. Those two trends point directly at each other, and something had to give. What gave was childbirth. Human babies are born earlier in their development, relative to other primates, and squeezed through a birth canal that is, by comparison of body size, unusually narrow and unusually risky. Before modern medicine, childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women across almost every human population on record. Every other great ape manages birth with a fraction of the danger. We do not, and the reason traces straight back to this trade. The back paid a price too. Four-legged mammals distribute their weight along a horizontal spine, like the deck of a bridge, evenly loaded. Ours got twisted into a vertical column, stacked directly on top of two hip joints, carrying the entire weight of the torso, arms, and head straight down through a lower back that a chimpanzee skeleton was never asked to manage. Lower back pain is essentially the maintenance bill on an unfinished renovation. I say this as someone who has thrown out his own back reaching for a drop pin. So believe me, there is no smugness in this observation. We inherited an upright spine from ancestors who were, in evolutionary terms, still figuring it out in real time, mid-experiment for a million years before anyone had the chance to fix the design. So this is the honest frame for the rest of the film. Bipedalism was not a triumphant leap that our ancestors were rewarded for. It was closer to a bet placed early that kept paying dividends in mobility and endurance while quietly running up a bill in obstetric risk and structural strain, a bill every human being alive today is still, in some small physical way, paying off. There's a second theory worth naming here, championed for years by the paleoanthropologist Owen Lovejoy, that ties bipedalism to something less about escaping danger and more about feeding a family. Freed hands meant a male could carry food back to a mate and offspring instead of foraging only for himself. And the fossil record shows a related clue. Hominin canine teeth shrink dramatically around this same period, a trait often linked, in other primates, to reduced male-on-male aggression over mates. Nobody treats that as a settled answer either. It is one more competing explanation in a field that has never lacked for competing explanations, sitting alongside the savanna hypothesis, the efficiency argument, and the wooded terrain evidence already provided. What all of them share is an admission that this single trait, walking on two legs, was consequential enough to be worth arguing about for half a century and counting. The obstetric cost gets starker the closer you look at it. Human babies are born at an earlier stage of brain development than any other primate's offspring, with a newborn skull holding roughly a quarter of its eventual adult brain volume, compared to closer to half in a newborn chimpanzee. Effectively, we are all born premature relative to our closest relatives, delivered early because a narrowed, upright walking pelvis simply could not safely pass a more fully developed skull. That early birth buys survival for the mother, at the cost of years of total helplessness for the infant. A newborn gazelle stands and runs within minutes. A newborn human cannot lift its own head for months, cannot walk for roughly a year, and remains dependent on adult caregivers for the better part of a decade. Bipedalism did not just reshape the skeleton. It rewired the entire structure of family, cooperation, and childhood. This lineage would need to survive its own solution. On the 24th of November, 1974, in a dry ravine in Ethiopia called Hadar, a paleoanthropologist named Donald Johansen spotted a small piece of forearm bone sticking out of a slope he had already walked past twice that morning. By the end of the dig, his team had recovered about 40% of a single skeleton, an extraordinary amount for a fossil this old. That night, back at camp, someone put on a Beatles record. The song playing was Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. The name stuck. Formally, she belongs to a species called Australopithecus afarensis, and she lived roughly 3.2 million years ago. For decades, she was the most complete early hominin skeleton ever found, which meant she was not just a curiosity, she was a testable body with joints and bones that could actually be measured against the question everyone wanted answered. Was this creature really walking upright, full-time on the ground? The pelvis and knees said yes. Lucy's hip joint is angled the way a habitual biped's hip is angled, and her knee shows the same inward carrying angle your own knee has, the one that keeps your feet under your center of gravity instead of splayed out to the sides. Whatever argument still existed about Artie's generation, Lucy settled it. By 3.2 million years ago, walking upright on the ground was not an experiment anymore. It was simply how this species got around. But Lucy's body is still, unmistakably, a body caught between two lives. Her fingers curve, the same shape found in animals that spend real-time gripping branches. Her shoulder blades sit angled upward, closer to a chimpanzee's than to yours, a configuration that helps with climbing and does very little for a creature that only ever needs to walk. She was built to move confidently on the ground and still climb a tree without much trouble. Both were still, apparently, necessary. In 2016, a team led by John Kappelman ran Lucy's bones through a high-resolution CT scanner and published a forensic case for how she actually died. A series of fractures, particularly a compressed break at the right shoulder, matched the pattern seen in modern trauma cases where a person falls from a significant height and instinctively reaches an arm out to break the impact. Their conclusion, still debated but taken seriously, was that Lucy likely died falling out of a tree. There is something almost unbearably specific about that. Not a spear wound, not a slow decline from illness, but a single bad moment, a branch that gave way or a grip that slipped at a height that should have been survivable for an animal built to climb on a body that had already started spending most of its life on the ground instead. Lucy is not the only afarensis fossil with a violent story attached. At a nearby site, researchers examining other Australopithecus remains found puncture marks in the bone consistent with the bite pattern of a large cat, likely a saber-toothed predator that shared this landscape. Put the evidence together and a clear picture forms. These were not the dominant animals of their ecosystem. They were quite often food. It is worth sitting with how small Lucy actually was. Around 3.5 feet tall, roughly 65 pounds, with a brain barely larger than a chimpanzee's, well under a third the size of yours. This was not a clever, dangerous ancestor outsmarting the landscape. This was a small, vulnerable primate, walking upright through territory shared with leopards, hyenas, and cats built to kill things exactly her size, with nothing yet resembling a weapon. That is the detail worth holding onto as this story moves forward. Bipedalism did not arrive bundled with intelligence or tools, or any obvious survival advantage against the predators already running this ecosystem. It arrived alone, millions of years ahead of the traits that would eventually make it worth the risk. For a very long stretch of our family's history, walking upright just meant walking upright, exposed on two legs through a world still built to eat you. Lucy was not the only Australopithecus who left a story behind. In 1924, at a quarry in South Africa, a skull belonging to a young child of the same broad genus was found, later named the Tong child. Decades later, researchers examining the skull identified puncture marks in the eye sockets, matching the talons of a large eagle. Evidence that this child was very likely killed and carried off by a bird of prey, the kind of predation modern raptors still occasionally inflict on young primates today. Not every Australopithecine line looked or lived like Lucy's either. A separate, more heavily built branch, known as the robust Australopithecines, and including a species nicknamed Nutcracker Man for its massive jaw and grinding teeth, specialized in tough, fibrous plant food. Huge flat molars built for crushing rather than slicing. That branch thrived for a time, then vanished entirely. One more dead end in the thicket, outcompeted or outadapted by relatives with smaller teeth and eventually sharper tools. In 2000, researchers in Dakika, Ethiopia, not far from where Lucy herself was found, uncovered the remarkably complete skeleton of a 3-year-old Australopithecus afarensis child, inevitably nicknamed Lucy's baby, though she predates Lucy by about 120,000 years. Her hyoid bone, a small, delicate structure in the throat involved in vocalization, was preserved well enough to examine, and it looks distinctly ape-like, more suited to the calls of a chimpanzee than to human speech. Put these fossils side by side, and a fuller picture of this era comes into focus. Small, vulnerable, still partly arboreal groups, raising children who took years to become independent, hunted from above by eagles and from the ground by cats, competing for resources against heavier-bodied cousins with a completely different survival strategy. None of it looked like destiny. It looked like a difficult, uncertain existence that could easily have ended with every single branch going extinct. Pick up an ordinary rock and try to make a knife out of it. Not by accident, not one lucky crack, but on purpose, again and again, striking at the right angle with the right force to peel off a sharp flake instead of just shattering the stone into rubble. It is harder than it sounds. It took our ancestors millions of years of upright walking before anyone on this family tree figured out how to do it reliably. The oldest confirmed stone tool tradition is called Oldowan, named after Oldoway Gorge in Tanzania, where archaeologists first identified it in large numbers. The technique is called percussion flaking, striking one stone, the core, with another, the hammer stone, at a precise angle to knock off flakes with edges sharp enough to cut hide, tendon, and meat far more efficiently than teeth or bare hands ever could. For a long time, credit for this went to a species named specifically for the association, Homo habilis, literally handyman, whose fossils turn up alongside these tools starting around 2.4 million years ago. It was a tidy story. New genus, new brain size, new technology, arriving together like a matched set. Then, in 2015, a team working at a site called Lomekwi in Kenya broke the tidy version. The tools at Lomekwi dated to roughly 3.3 million years old, 700,000 years before Homo habilis is thought to have existed. Whoever made them was almost certainly an Australopithecine, the same genus as Lucy, walking the same landscape, with the same small brain barely larger than a chimpanzee's. The tools were cruder than classic Oldowan work, but they were unmistakably deliberate. That discovery collapsed a comfortable assumption a lot of textbooks have been leaning on, that tool-making required a bigger brain first, that intelligence came before technology and made it possible. The Lomekwi find suggests something closer to the opposite order, or at least a much messier back and forth, where a small-brained hominin started experimenting with stone long before its brain had grown into anything resembling ours. Around the same broad window, hominin brain size does start to climb, slowly at first, from something close to a chimpanzee's to something noticeably larger. And there is a real, testable reason to think tools and brains were feeding each other. Stone flakes let a small, weak animal cut into carcasses other predators had already killed and butcher them fast enough to escape before a hyena or a leopard came back to claim its meal. Meat, and specifically the fat and marrow inside bones that stone tools could finally crack open, delivers far more calories per bite than the roots, leaves, and fruit that made up most of an Australopithecine's diet. Brain tissue is metabolically expensive. It burns a disproportionate share of the body's energy just sitting there thinking. A richer diet may have been what first made a bigger brain affordable to grow and to keep running. So which came first, the smarter brain or the sharper stone? Honestly, the field has not settled it, and probably never will with total certainty, because the real answer is likely a loop rather than a starting line. A slightly bigger brain makes slightly better tools possible. Slightly better tools unlock slightly richer food. Slightly richer food funds a slightly bigger brain. Run that loop for a few 100,000 years, and the numbers start to move. What matters most here is not the chicken and egg debate. It is what a stone tool actually is in the coldest possible terms. It is the first time anything on this family tree extended its own body's capability with an object that was not part of its body. A sharper tooth than any tooth it was born with. A tool is a promise a species makes to itself that it intends to keep getting better at surviving. And it is a promise this lineage never really stopped making. Homo habilis itself was named in 1964 by Louis Leakey, Philip Tobias, and John Napier, based on fossils recovered from Oldaway Gorge alongside the stone tools that gave the species its name. Its brain, at roughly 550 cubic centimeters on average, was noticeably larger than an Australopithecines, though still under half the size of yours, and its hand bones show a more developed opposable thumb, better suited to the firm, precise grip flint napping actually requires. The species has never sat comfortably in its own category, either. Some researchers argue habilis is different enough from later Homo species that it barely deserves to be called Homo at all, closer in most respects to a slightly larger-brained Australopithecus. Others treat it as a legitimate, if messy, first chapter of our own genus. The label has become something close to a wastebasket taxon, a convenient name for a scatter of fossils that do not cleanly agree with each other. What is not disputed is what the tools themselves reveal about behavior. At Oldaway and at other Oldowan sites, animal bones turn up bearing cut marks made by stone flakes, deliberately scraped to remove meat, alongside separate percussion marks from smashing the bone open for marrow. In several cases, those cut marks overlie tooth marks left by carnivores, suggesting these early toolmakers were as often scavenging kills left behind by bigger predators as they were hunting prey themselves. Picture what that actually required in practice. A small, weak, unarmed hominin, waiting nearby while a lion or a pack of hyenas finished feeding, then moving in fast with nothing but a sharpened rock to strip whatever scraps of meat and marrow remained before the original predators returned. It is not a glamorous origin story. It is a resourceful, high-risk one, and it worked well enough to keep this lineage fed through a period when almost everything else on the landscape still outclassed it physically. In 1991, in the small town of Denisovans, in the Republic of Georgia, archaeologists digging beneath a medieval church found something that did not belong there. Stone tools, then animal bones. Then, over the following years, 5 remarkably well-preserved hominin skulls, dated to roughly 1.8 million years old, 4,000 miles outside Africa. Nothing that old, that far from the continent where our lineage began, was supposed to exist. The species is Homo erectus, and it is worth stopping to look at what it actually looked like because it is the first hominin on this family tree that would not look entirely alien standing next to you. Long legs, built for covering ground efficiently. A narrower pelvis than earlier ancestors, closer to modern proportions. A body clearly optimized for something Lucy's generation never needed. Distance. Some researchers argue erectus was built to run far, not merely walk far, an endurance hunter capable of chasing prey animals for hours in open heat until the animal collapsed from exhaustion. A hunting strategy that depends on almost nothing except patience, sweat glands, and legs that do not quit. Whether or not that specific strategy is correct, the underlying anatomy is not in dispute. This is a body designed for range. And it used that range immediately. The Denisovans population was not an isolated fluke either. Homo erectus fossils and tools eventually turn up as far east as Indonesia, meaning within a relatively short span of evolutionary time. This species had already crossed most of the Old World, adapting to climates its immediate ancestors in East Africa had never once encountered. That kind of range raises an obvious, uncomfortable question. How does a hominin survive a genuinely cold season, or cook meat tough enough to otherwise waste hours of chewing without fire? The honest answer is that the evidence for fire this early is real, but still argued over in ways that matter to how we understand the species. At Wonderwerk Cave, in South Africa, researchers found burned bone fragments and ash residues dated to roughly 1 million years ago, deep enough inside the cave that a natural wildfire reaching that spot is extremely unlikely. It is one of the strongest cases for controlled fire use by Homo erectus that currently exists, though even here, scientists are careful about the word controlled, since maintaining a fire is a different skill than sparking one on command. The stakes of that argument are bigger than they sound. The primatologist Richard Wrangham has spent much of his career arguing that cooking food changed human evolution directly. That softened, calorie-dense cooked meat and starches freed up digestive energy the body could then redirect toward growing and running a larger brain. If he is right, fire is not just a survival tool. It may be one of the engines behind everything this lineage became afterward. Whatever the precise mechanism, the outcome is not in dispute. For well over 1 million years, Homo erectus was, by any reasonable measure, the most successful hominin that had ever existed. Wider range than anything before it. Longer duration on Earth than our own species has managed so far. A body built like a long-distance machine, running on a diet its ancestors could never have accessed. It is tempting, looking back from here, to treat erectus as a warm-up act, a placeholder species biding time, until something more familiar showed up. That framing does not survive contact with the timeline. Erectus populations were still walking parts of Southeast Asia as recently as roughly 100,000 years ago, meaning this species, casually dismissed as primitive in almost every textbook illustration, very likely outlasted several of the more advanced hominins that are about to enter this story. One skeleton captures the physical reality of this species better than almost any other fossil in human origins record. In 1984, near Lake Turkana in Kenya, researchers uncovered the near-complete remains of a boy, roughly 8 to 12 years old at death, who lived about 1.6 million years ago. Nicknamed Turkana Boy, his skeleton shows a tall, slender, long-legged build startlingly close to a modern human adolescence, a body already optimized for heat dissipation and long-distance walking across open country. The technology traveling with this species eventually improved too. Around 1.76 million years ago, a new stone tool tradition appears in the record, called Acheulean, named for a site in France where examples were first classified. Unlike the simple, irregular flakes of Oldowan technology, Acheulean hand axes are symmetrical, teardrop-shaped, worked on both sides with real deliberate design, a tool that required planning several steps ahead rather than a single opportunistic strike. Erectus fossils and associated tools eventually turn up as far as Zhoukoudian, near modern Beijing, a site whose original specimens, collectively known as Peking Man, were tragically lost while being transported for safekeeping during the turmoil of the Second World War. Only casts and detailed notes survive of some of the original bones, a reminder that even the physical evidence for this story is not immune to the ordinary disasters of more recent human history. Even the fire evidence at that same site has had to be revisited. Ash layers at Zhoukoudian were long cited as strong proof of erectus controlled fire use, until a 1998 reanalysis found the deposits lacked the chemical signatures a genuine hearth should leave behind, suggesting at least some of that evidence may have been misread. It is a useful, humbling case study in how this entire field keeps correcting itself, discovery by discovery, as better methods catch up to older, more confident claims. In September 2003, in a limestone cave called Liang Bua on the Indonesian island of Flores, an Australian and Indonesian archaeological team digging through sediment layers hit a nearly complete skeleton, roughly 3 feet tall, with a brain not much larger than chimpanzees. It was dated at the time to around 18,000 years old, which meant, if the dating and the species identification held up, this tiny, strange relative had still been alive well within the era of cave paintings in France. The team, led by Peter Brown and Mike Morwood, named it Homo floresiensis. The press, inevitably, called it the Hobbit, and the nickname stuck so hard that some scientific papers use it half-seriously to this day. Underneath the nickname sat a real and fairly startling anatomical claim. A distinct human species, isolated on one island, that had gotten smaller over time instead of larger. The leading explanation is a well-documented evolutionary pattern called island dwarfism, sometimes island rule, on islands with limited food and no large predators to stay big enough to outrun. Large mammal species tend to shrink over many generations, since a smaller body needs fewer calories to survive on a landmass that cannot support many of anything. Flores had already produced dwarfed elephants, a species called stegodon, roughly the size of a large cow. Floresiensis, if the theory holds, was the human version of the same pressure. Not everyone accepted the new species claim, and the fight that followed got unusually bitter, even by paleoanthropology's combative standards. A vocal group of researchers argued the skeleton was not a separate species at all, just a modern human with a severe developmental condition, most often cited as microcephaly, a disorder that causes an abnormally small skull. If true, Floresiensis was not evidence of anything new, just one unlucky and now very famous individual. The counter-evidence built slowly but landed hard. Additional individuals were found at the same site, undercutting the idea that this was one unfortunate anomaly, since a whole population sharing the identical rare condition strains credulity. The wrist bones showed a primitive, non-modern structure closer to earlier hominins or even apes. And critically, later, more precise dating pushed the site's key sediment layers back further, to somewhere between about 100,000 and 60,000 years old. Stone tools associated with the species, however, continue on Flores until roughly 50,000 years ago, meaning whatever population made them was very likely still there, still alive, deep into the window when Homo sapiens was already spreading through Southeast Asia. Nobody has yet found the smoking gun evidence of direct contact between the two species on the island, but the overlap in time and geography sits close enough to be genuinely uncomfortable. Local Flores folklore, collected by anthropologists long before the 2003 discovery, describes small, hairy, forest-dwelling people called Abugogo, said to have lived on the island within the memory of recent generations. Nobody is claiming that folklore is literal proof of anything, but it is the kind of detail a documentary about this species cannot responsibly leave out, because it is exactly the sort of coincidence that keeps this particular mystery alive in the popular imagination, whatever the scientific consensus eventually settles on. Flores had a matching predator to go with its dwarf prey. Komodo dragons, the largest living lizards on Earth, still patrol the island today, and fossil evidence shows even larger varanid lizards shared the landscape with Floresiensis. Island isolation cuts both ways. Small mammals tend to shrink when food is scarce and large predators are absent, while reptiles with slower metabolisms and different growth patterns can sometimes grow larger in the very same conditions. Floresiensis lived its entire existence in the shadow of an apex predator built like something out of an older, harsher geological age. In 2016, researchers working at a nearby site called Mata Minch, also on Flores, found jaw and teeth fragments dated to roughly 700,000 years ago, notably smaller even than the Liangbua remains that first defined the species. That find pushed the dwarfing timeline back considerably and suggested the shrinking process had largely finished remarkably early, meaning this population spent an enormous span of time, hundreds of thousands of years, simply persisting at this reduced scale rather than continuing to change. Cut marks and burn traces found on the bones of stegodon, the dwarf elephant relative that shared the island, suggest Floresiensis was capable of coordinated large animal hunting despite a brain smaller than a chimpanzee's, a detail that keeps unsettling assumptions about the minimum cognitive requirements for organized, cooperative behavior. Whatever this species was doing to bring down an animal many times its own body weight, it was not doing it alone, and it was not doing it by accident. Flores turned out not to be a one-off. In 2019, researchers working Calao Cave on the Philippine island of Luzon announced a separate, small-bodied hominin species, Homo luzonensis, known from teeth and a handful of hand and foot bones dated to between roughly 50,000 and 67,000 years old. Like Floresiensis, it shows a strange mix of primitive, ape-like curved finger and toe bones alongside more modern dental features on a completely different island, evolving in isolation on a completely separate timeline. two separate island populations, thousands of miles apart, both apparently descended from some earlier, larger-bodied ancestor, both shrinking down to a similarly small scale, both surviving deep into the same broad era Homo sapiens was actively spreading through the region. Island dwarfism, it turns out, was not a strange one-time accident on Flores. It was a pattern this genus was capable of repeating wherever the right isolated conditions presented themselves. In September 2013, two recreational cavers exploring the Rising Star cave system northwest of Johannesburg, South Africa, squeezed through a vertical fissure so narrow in places that it measures barely 7 inches across, and found a chamber floor scattered with bones. When paleoanthropologist Lee Berger realized what he was looking at, he faced an immediate, very literal problem. He could not fit through the passage himself. So he put out a public call through Facebook for scientists who were, in his own phrasing, slender and not claustrophobic. 6 women answered and were selected, and the press nicknamed them the Underground Astronauts. Over weeks of excavation, squeezing through a passage called Superman's Crawl and down a nearly vertical chute barely wide enough for a shoulder, they recovered the remains of at least 15 individuals from a chamber now called the naledi chamber. The species, named Homo naledi, has a strange, split-screen anatomy of its own. The shoulders and fingers show curvature suited to climbing, similar to much older hominins. The feet and legs look closer to a modern human's, built for efficient upright walking. And the brain, reconstructed from the skull's interior volume, measures somewhere between roughly 460 and 610 cubic centimeters, close to the size of an orange, and less than a third the volume of yours. Here is the detail that turned this from an interesting new fossil into a genuine controversy. In 2017, more precise dating placed these remains at somewhere between 335,000 and 236,000 years old. That is startlingly recent for a hominin with a brain this small, meaning Homo naledi was very likely alive at roughly the same time Homo sapiens itself was beginning to emerge elsewhere on the same continent. So how did 15 individuals end up in a chamber this deep, this dark, this difficult to reach, with no evidence that predators dragged them there, and no obvious natural pathway for a body to simply wash or fall in? Berger's team proposed the most provocative answer available, that Homo naledi carried its dead into this chamber on purpose, repeatedly, over time, as a form of deliberate disposal. If confirmed, that claim upends a comfortable assumption that has anchored a lot of thinking about human evolution, that symbolic behavior around death required a large, sapiens-level brain. A brain the size of an orange managing that kind of behavior would mean ritual, or at least intentional treatment of the dead, is far older and far less exclusively ours than most of the field has been willing to accept. Not everyone in the field is convinced, and the pushback has been sharp. Critics point out that the deliberate burial claim, and later, even more contested announcements from the same team about possible engravings on the cave walls and traces of fire use, were released to the public before completing the standard peer review process most paleoanthropological claims go through. Alternative explanations, bodies washing into the chamber through channels no longer visible today, or naledi individuals dying there while sheltering, have not been fully ruled out. The excavators who actually reached the naledi chamber describe a passage so tight in places that it required removing pieces of equipment and passing them through separately, crawling on their stomachs through sections barely wider than their shoulders, in near total darkness, aware the entire time that a rockfall or a stuck limb could turn a scientific expedition into a rescue operation nobody nearby was equipped to run. Brain size is not the whole story, either. Endocasts, detailed casts taken of the interior surface of the skull, suggest naledi's small brain was organized with a surprisingly complex frontal lobe structure, the region associated in living primates with planning and social behavior. A brain can apparently be small in raw volume and still be wired with real behavioral sophistication built into its shape, a distinction easy to miss if you only ever look at the number on a measuring tape. In 2023, Berger's team went further still, publishing preliminary claims of possible engraved markings on the cave walls near the burial chamber and traces suggesting controlled fire use deep inside the cave system. Evidence that would place symbolic mark making and fire management inside a small-brained hominin population roughly 250,000 years before either behavior is confidently documented anywhere else. Those claims landed with even more skepticism than the burial hypothesis, precisely because of how much weight they would need to carry if confirmed. The dating of the remains was not left to a single method either, precisely because the field understood how much weight this particular set of numbers would need to carry. Researchers ran 6 independent dating techniques on the sediment, the flowstone deposits, and the teeth themselves: uranium-thorium dating, electron spin resonance, and optically stimulated luminescence among them, and all 6 converged on roughly the same window. That kind of cross-method agreement is what eventually convinced most skeptics the age itself, whatever its behavioral implications, was solid. The cave system itself takes its name, Rising Star, from an old mining claim in the area, and the chamber where the bones were found was named naledi, meaning Chamber of Stars in the local Sesuda language, chosen by the team almost as a small act of respect for what they had found sitting in the dark for 250,000 years, waiting. In 1908, a nearly complete Neanderthal skeleton was found at La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France, and the French paleontologist Marcelin Boule spent the next several years reconstructing it. His version slouched, bent knees, a hunched spine, a forward jutting head, an image that dominated public imagination for decades afterward. Later analysis found the individual had suffered from severe arthritis and had lost most of his teeth. Boule had reconstructed a sick old man and handed the entire species his limp. It took most of a century to properly walk that image back. Homo neanderthalensis emerged and spread across Eurasia by roughly 400,000 years ago, and thrived there through repeated brutal ice ages for longer than Homo sapiens has yet existed as a species. The body built for that cold was not hunched or clumsy. It was compact, powerfully muscled, with a barrel chest suited to warming frigid air before it reached the lungs. They hunted large, dangerous animals at close range: mammoths, woolly rhinoceros, cave bears, using thrusting spears that required getting near enough to be genuinely at risk of goring or trampling. Skeletal analysis of Neanderthal remains shows a strikingly high rate of heel fractures concentrated in the head, neck, and upper body, a pattern researchers have compared to the injury profile of modern rodeo athletes. This was not a species that avoided danger. It absorbed it repeatedly and kept surviving. And it took care of its injured. At Shanidar Cave, in what is now Iraq, one skeleton, known as Shanidar 1, belonged to an individual who had survived into what would then have been considered old age despite being blind in one eye, missing part of an arm, and showing signs of a leg injury that likely affected his ability to walk without assistance. None of those conditions were survivable alone. Someone, or several someones, kept this man alive for years after his body stopped being able to fully provide for itself. Symbolic behavior, the kind of thing older textbooks insisted only Homo sapiens was capable of, turns up in the Neanderthal record too, and in some cases turns up earlier than anything sapiens left behind in the same region. At Krpina, in Croatia, researchers found eagle talons bearing cut marks consistent with removing them for use as jewelry, dated to around 130,000 years ago, long before any confirmed sapiens presence in Europe. The most striking evidence arrived in 2018. Using uranium-thorium dating, a technique that does not rely on organic material and can reach much further back than radiocarbon dating, a research team led by Dirk Hoffman dated red pigment markings inside 3 caves in Spain, including La Paisiega and Cueva de los Avions, to at least 64,000 years old. That is roughly 20,000 years before Homo sapiens is currently confirmed to have reached the Iberian Peninsula at all. There's only one species that could have painted those walls. if the dating holds, and it has survived considerable scrutiny since publication. Neanderthals were making cave art before we were anywhere nearby to teach them, borrow from them, or take credit. The entire premise of who invented symbolic culture first quietly cracked open. One statistic tends to surprise people more than any other. On average, Neanderthal brains measured slightly larger than the average modern human brain, somewhere around 1,500 cubic centimeters, compared to roughly 1,350 in living humans today. Larger does not automatically mean smarter. Brain organization and body size both factor into what a given volume of neural tissue is actually built to do, but the number alone is enough to permanently retire the old image of Neanderthals as simply dim-witted. Their toolkit, known to archaeologists as the Mysterian tradition, included a genuinely sophisticated piece of chemistry. Birch bark tar, produced by carefully heating bark in a low-oxygen environment to extract a sticky adhesive used to half-stone points onto wooden shafts. Replicating that process today, using only Stone Age methods, takes real skill and planning, multiple steps performed in a specific sequence with no room for improvisation. This was not trial and error. It was inherited, taught knowledge. Their diet was broader than the old stereotype of a pure big-game hunter allows for, too. Excavations at Bajandillo Cave, in Spain, found shellfish remains in Neanderthal occupation layers dating back over 150,000 years. Evidence of coastal foraging that predates any confirmed Homo sapiens presence in the region by a wide margin. Cooked plant starches have turned up on Neanderthal teeth as well, preserved in dental plaque, pointing to a diet that adapted to whatever a given landscape actually offered. It is worth noting that Neanderthals were the very first human species ever formally recognized as scientifically distinct from us, decades before Lucy, before Toomai, before any of the deep prehistory covered earlier in this film had even been imagined. Bones found in 1856 in Germany's Neander Valley prompted anatomist William King to propose, in 1864, a species entirely separate from modern humans. Everyone else in this documentary got added to the family tree only after Neanderthals had already forced open the question of whether more than one kind of human could have existed at all. Their skeletons carry the cold, adapted engineering throughout. A wide, projecting nasal cavity, larger than a modern human's, likely functioned to warm and humidify frigid air before it ever reached the lungs, reducing the physical strain that breathing sub-zero air imposes on delicate lung tissue. Bone density measurements across their skeleton run consistently higher than in modern humans, evidence of a body built to absorb repeated physical impact, exactly the kind their close-range hunting style would have guaranteed. In 2008, researchers working in Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia recovered a small fragment of finger bone, barely the size of a fingernail, from a layer of sediment. It did not look remarkable. Bone fragments this small are common at excavation sites, and most tell you very little on their own. This one went to Svana Pabo's ancient DNA laboratory in Germany, where the entire field of human origins research was about to get a new chapter it had not been expecting. In 2010, Pabo's team published their results. The DNA extracted from that finger bone did not match Homo sapiens. It did not match Neanderthal DNA either, despite Neanderthal remains having also been found in the same cave. It belonged to something else entirely, a previously unknown hominin population, now called the Denisovans, named simply after the cave, because there was not enough physical material to justify giving them their own formal species named the way Homo neanderthalensis had earned one. That is worth pausing on. This is the first hominin group in the history of the field to be identified primarily through genetics rather than through skeletal anatomy. Every other named human species so far in this documentary was defined by a skull, a pelvis, a jaw, something a researcher could physically look at and measure. Denisovans were defined by a sequence of letters, A, T, C, and G, pulled out of a splinter of bone. The physical evidence has grown slightly since then, but not by much. A single molar tooth, also from Denisova Cave, turned out to belong to the same population. Then, in 2019, researchers reanalyzed a large, robust jawbone that had been sitting in a monastery in China after being found decades earlier on the Tibetan plateau. Ancient protein analysis, since DNA itself had not survived, confirmed it as Denisovan, roughly 160,000 years old, at an altitude over 10,000 feet. That jawbone matters enormously because it means this population was not confined to one Siberian cave. It was living and apparently thriving at extreme high altitude on the Tibetan plateau, one of the harshest environments any hominin has ever occupied, hundreds of miles from the cave that gave the species its name. A handful of bone fragments scattered across a landscape that size is an almost absurdly thin trail for a population this geographically ambitious. The genetic footprint tells a much bigger story than the bones do. Modern human populations across Asia and Oceania carry measurable amounts of Denisovan ancestry, with populations in Melanesia and Papua New Guinea carrying the highest known percentages, up to around 4 to 6% of their genome. To leave a mark that widespread, Denisovans must have ranged across an enormous stretch of Asia, interacting with multiple different human populations for a very long time. Researchers have started calling this pattern a ghost lineage, a population whose genetic influence is unmistakable and widespread, while its physical remains stay almost entirely invisible. It is an unsettling kind of presence, not extinct in the way a species with no living trace is extinct, and not really findable either in the way a well-documented fossil species is findable. Just there underneath in the genome, everywhere and almost nowhere at once. In 2018, that same cave delivered perhaps the single most extraordinary fossil in this entire film. A tiny bone fragment, cataloged as Denisova 11 and nicknamed Denny, belonged to a girl who died around 13 years old. Genetic analysis showed her mother was Neanderthal and her father was Denisovan, making her, as far as anyone has ever found, a direct, first-generation hybrid between two distinct human species, not an inference for population statistics, but one individual, one family, caught in the act of crossing a boundary science had only recently learned existed. Denisovans still do not have a fully agreed upon formal species name in the way Homo neanderthalensis does. Researchers sometimes informally suggest Homo denisova, but the physical fossil record remains too sparse and too fragmentary for the field to commit to it with confidence. It is a strange kind of scientific limbo, a population real and consequential enough to have reshaped the genetics of entire modern regions, still waiting on a name that fits. In 2019, a research team led by David Gochman attempted something that sounds almost impossible, reconstructing what a Denisovan might have physically looked like using only patterns of chemical modification on their extracted DNA without a skull to measure directly. Their model predicted a broad, robust face, a wide pelvis, and other features distinct from both Neanderthals and modern humans. A portrait built entirely out of molecular shadow, a face assembled from data with no photograph, no skull, and almost no bone to check it against. There's one more genuinely strange gap in what we know about this population. Despite ranging across a huge stretch of Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, no stone tool industry has ever been confidently and exclusively attributed to Denisovans specifically. Tools found in layers containing Denisovan remains often sit close enough to Neanderthal or later sapiens material that assigning a specific technology to Denisovan hands alone remains genuinely uncertain. An entire population, widespread and consequential, whose toolkit nobody can currently point to with confidence. Sit with the asymmetry of that for a second, because it is the whole point of this chapter distilled into one fact. We know Denisovans help Tibetans breathe at extreme altitude. We know they interbred with at least 2 other human species. We know one of their daughters at least existed and died a teenager in a Siberian cave. And we still could not, if you handed us one of their hand axes today, necessarily tell you it belonged to them at all. In 1961, miners working a barite quarry in Jebel, Irhoud, Morocco, uncovered skull. For decades, it was filed away as an African variant of Neanderthal, or something close to it, dated at the time to around 40,000 years old, a stray branch that did not fit neatly anywhere. It sat in that category, mostly unremarkable, for over half a century. Then, in 2017, a team led by Jean-Jacques Hublin returned to the site, recovered more remains, and applied modern dating techniques to the layers of stone tools found alongside the bones. The new number that came back was not 40,000 years. It was roughly 300,000 years, nearly 100,000 years earlier than the previous oldest confirmed evidence for our own species anywhere on the planet. That single revised date rewrote the opening chapter of our own species' history overnight. And the skull itself is worth looking at closely because it does not look like a finished modern human, and it does not look like something else either. The face is flat, delicate, proportioned almost exactly like a face you would pass on a street today. The brain case behind it is long and low, more elongated, more archaic, closer to older hominins than to you. In other words, a mosaic, a modern face bolted, evolutionarily speaking, onto a brain case that had not finished catching up. This was not the arrival of a completed product, dropped fully formed into the world. It was a population caught mid-transition, evolving in pieces, the face changing on a different schedule than the skull surrounding the brain. It also broke a simpler, more comforting story a lot of people still carry around, that Homo sapiens has one clean birthplace, a single valley or cave somewhere in East Africa where our species switched on. Jebel Irhoud sits in Morocco, in the far northwest corner of the continent, thousands of miles from the East African sites that used to be treated as the origin point, combined with other early sapiens fossils scattered across the continent. The picture that is emerging looks less like one cradle and more like many. Researchers now increasingly describe early Homo sapiens as evolving across Africa as a whole, in loosely connected regional populations exchanging genes with each other over vast stretches of time and territory, rather than radiating outward from one single point of origin. Africa, 300,000 years ago, was not a blank stage waiting for the main character to arrive. It was already a large, complicated, occupied continent. And that is really the point this chapter needs to land, more than any single skull or date. Homo sapiens did not step onto an empty stage. At the moment this species appears in the fossil record, Homo naledi may still have been alive in South African caves. Homo erectus populations were likely still holding on in parts of Southeast Asia. Neanderthals and Denisovans were already well established across Europe and Asia, doing everything covered in the last two chapters. This new arrival was just one more hominin in a landscape that was already crowded. It was not, by any evidence available from this period, the dominant one. Small, scattered populations, no larger brain than some of its neighbors, no obvious technological edge yet. Nothing in the archaeological record from this window suggesting anyone should have bet on this particular branch outlasting all the others. Before the Irhoud redating, the oldest confirmed Homo sapiens fossils came from two Ethiopian sites, Omo Kaibish and Irhoud, both dated as somewhere between roughly 195,000 and 233,000 years old. A separate skull from Florisbad, South Africa, adds a third data point around 260,000 years. Together with Irhoud, these sites stop looking like isolated curiosities and start looking like scattered fragments of one much larger, continent-wide population, emerging unevenly across Africa rather than at any single point. The stone tools found alongside the Irhoud remains use a technique called levallois, a method requiring the toolmaker to carefully shape a stone core in advance so that a single, final strike produces a flake of a predetermined size and shape. It demands planning several steps ahead of the actual cutting edge you end up holding, a kind of technological forethought that outpaces almost anything associated with earlier hominins in this film. Genetic estimates for the total early Homo sapiens population across this entire window remain strikingly modest, likely numbering in the tens of thousands at most, spread thin across an enormous continent in small, semi-isolated bands. This was not a triumphant new arrival sweeping the board. It was a fragile, scattered experiment, no more obviously destined for success than Homo naledi, floresiensis, or any other hominin sharing the planet at the same moment. Hold that fragility in mind as the film moves forward from here, because everything that follows, the symbols, the migrations, the survival through catastrophe, the eventual encounters with Neanderthals and Denisovans, all of it happened to a population that had no way of knowing it would be the one left telling this story. It could just as easily have been one more name on the list from Chapter 1. On South Africa's southern Cape coast sits a cave called Blombos, and inside it, archaeologist Christopher Hinchelwood's team found a small, flat piece of ochre, a soft reddish stone, with a deliberate crosshatch pattern scratched into its surface. Dated to roughly 73,000 years ago, it is not a tool. It does nothing. It catches nothing, cuts nothing, carries nothing. It exists purely as a mark someone chose to make. That same cave produced something even stranger in 2011, a genuine 100,000-year-old paint-making kit. 2 large abalone shells, used as mixing containers, held traces of ground ochre combined with charcoal, crushed bone, and a binding liquid, along with the grinding stones used to process them. Someone had assembled ingredients, mixed a compound, and stored the leftover material for later use. That is not an instinct. That is planning. Jewelry turns up in the same window and in more than one place. At Blombos and separately at Skull and Kafsa in what is now Israel, archaeologists found small sea snail shells from a genus called Necerius, deliberately pierced and showing where patterns consistent with being strung and worn against skin or clothing for extended periods. These shells carry no caloric value, no defensive use, nothing a strict survival calculation would ever justify spending time on. And yet someone did spend the time, repeatedly, across different regions, different populations, separated by enormous distances. Wearing a shell around your neck signals something to the people around you: status, group identity, relationship, something. It only works as a signal if everyone nearby already shares an understanding of what that signal means. That shared understanding is itself evidence of something remarkable happening inside these populations' heads. The obvious question hanging over all of it is language. Could these populations talk to each other in anything resembling the structured, grammatical way you are hearing this sentence right now? The honest answer is that nobody can directly test a 100,000-year-old population speech, because language leaves no fossil. What survives are only its footprints, coordinated behavior, shared symbols, technology too complex to teach through imitation alone. Geneticists have found one small, tantalizing piece of physical evidence: a gene called FOXP2, linked in modern humans to fine motor control of the mouth and throat needed for fluent speech, carries a specific mutation shared by both Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, suggesting the biological hardware for complex speech was already present well before this window, inherited from a common ancestor further back. Having the hardware installed is not the same as knowing when or how fully anyone started running the software. So the field lives with genuine uncertainty here, and that uncertainty is worth respecting rather than papering over. Some researchers argue language, in something close to its modern form, emerged gradually over hundreds of thousands of years, alongside tool complexity and brain growth. Others argue for something closer to a rapid shift, a threshold crossed relatively suddenly, that then made everything else in this chapter, the ochre, the shells, the planning, possible almost all at once. At Deep Kloof Rock Shelter, also in South Africa, archaeologists found fragments of ostrich eggshell, used as portable water flasks, deliberately engraved with repeating geometric patterns and dated to roughly 60,000 years ago. The patterns appear consistently enough across multiple fragments that researchers suspect they functioned as a kind of group marker, a visual signature identifying whose water container this was, evidence of symbolic communication embedded in an entirely practical, everyday object. At Sibudu Cave, in the same broad region, researchers uncovered layered bedding dated to around 77,000 years ago, made from bundled sedge and rush plants, with a distinct top layer identified as a species from the Cryptocarya genus, a plant containing natural insect repellent compounds. Someone 77,000 years ago was building a mattress and then treating it against bed bugs, a level of domestic problem solving that rarely makes it into the popular imagination of what deep prehistory actually looked like. Not everyone in the field agrees on how to interpret the pace of all this change, and the disagreement has its own name. Some researchers, following a model sometimes called the human revolution, argue symbolic behavior arrived in a relatively sudden burst, a cognitive threshold crossed abruptly. An influential 2000 paper by Sally McBrearty and Alison Brooks, titled The Revolution That Wasn't, argued the opposite, that these behaviors accumulate gradually across hundreds of thousands of years across Africa, and only look sudden because the earlier evidence is thinner and harder to find. What makes the record even harder to read cleanly is that this behavior does not arrive and simply stay, growing steadily from that point onward. The pierced shell beads found at roughly 120,000 years old appear to fall out of the archaeological record for tens of thousands of years afterward, before reappearing at later sites. Culture, on the evidence currently available, did not switch on like a light. It flickered, present in one population for a while, absent or invisible in the record for generations, then present again somewhere else entirely. Roughly 74,000 years ago, on the island of Sumatra, a volcano erupted with a force that has no equal anywhere in recorded human history. The Toba eruption ejected somewhere around 2,800 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere, ash thick enough to bury entire regions of South Asia under a layer several centimeters deep, thousands of miles from the source. Nothing a living human being has ever witnessed compares to it. An eruption at that scale does not just bury land near the volcano. It injects massive quantities of sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere, where it can linger for years, reflecting sunlight back into space and cooling the planet's surface. Ice core records show a sharp temperature drop in the years following Toba, and some estimates put the resulting volcanic winter as severe enough to collapse plant growth across large parts of the globe for years at stretch. In 1998, geneticist Stanley Ambrose proposed a striking explanation for something researchers had already noticed independently. Modern human DNA shows unusually low genetic diversity for a species that is spread across the entire planet. His bottleneck hypothesis argued that Toba's climate catastrophe crashed the global human population down to a shockingly small number, some estimates as low as a few thousand breeding individuals, before the species slowly rebuilt from those survivors. Sit with that number for a moment. A few thousand breeding individuals is smaller than the population of a single modern small town. Every person alive today, all 8 billion of US, would trace back through a genetic funnel narrow enough to fit inside a high school gymnasium. For years, that image became one of the most cited near miss extinction stories in all of human prehistory. The archaeology, though, has not cooperated quietly with the story. In 2018, a team led by Curtis Marian excavating a coastal site called Pinnacle Point in South Africa found microscopic shards of Toba's volcanic glass embedded directly within sediment layers that showed continuous, uninterrupted human occupation before, during, and after the eruption. Whoever was living at that site did not vanish. They kept making tools, kept eating shellfish, kept living exactly where they had been living straight through the supposed catastrophe. That does not necessarily disprove a global population crash elsewhere. It is entirely possible some regions were devastated while a resilient coastal population in southern Africa, with reliable access to shellfish and a relatively mild climate, weathered the disaster largely intact. The genetic bottleneck signal in modern DNA is real and still needs an explanation. Whether Toba alone is that explanation, or whether the low diversity stems from a longer, slower population squeeze unrelated to any single eruption, remains a genuinely open question. Volcanologists rank eruptions on a logarithmic scale called the Volcanic Explosivity Index, and Toba sits at the very top of it, a magnitude 8, the highest category the scale defines. For comparison, the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora, itself powerful enough to trigger what became known as the year without a summer across parts of the world, ranks 4 full steps lower, meaning Toba released something on the order of 1,000 times more material into the atmosphere than an eruption still remembered today for causing global famine. Ice cores drilled from Greenland and Antarctica preserve a sharp spike in sulfate deposits corresponding to roughly this same period, chemical fallout from an eruption powerful enough to circle the entire planet. The original bottleneck hypothesis was actually first proposed in 1992 by geologists Michael Rampino and Stephen Self, based on this climate evidence alone, before Stanley Ambrose connected it explicitly to the low genetic diversity later found in modern human DNA. It is worth separating out a related idea this chapter could easily get tangled up with. Population geneticists also talk about a figure, sometimes nicknamed mitochondrial Eve, the most recent common maternal line ancestor of every living human, estimated to have lived somewhere between roughly 150,000 and 200,000 years ago. That figure predates Toba by tens of thousands of years and reflects a completely different kind of calculation, and conflating the two, as popular explanations sometimes carelessly do, misrepresents what either one is actually measuring. There is something worth sitting within the gap between that number and where the species ended up. A population small enough, by some estimates, to fit inside a single stadium is the ancestor of every human alive today, all 8 billion of us, spread across every continent except Antarctica, running experiments on our own genome. Whatever else this film gets across, that particular scale of recovery deserves to register as something close to astonishing. For most of the 20th century, the relationship between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals was treated as a closed question. Different species, no interbreeding, a clean evolutionary line separating us from them. In 2010, Svana Pabo's team at the Max Planck Institute published the first draft sequence of the Neanderthal genome, reconstructed from fragments of ancient DNA, and that clean line dissolved almost immediately. The comparison showed that people with ancestry outside Africa carry somewhere around 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA, a small but completely unmistakable genetic signature. It was not contamination, and it was not a fluke. Multiple independent research groups, working with different samples and different methods, kept finding the same result. Somewhere in the tens of thousands of years after Homo sapiens left Africa, we met Neanderthals, and in more than one place, we had children with them. The best current estimates place the main pulse of interbreeding somewhere between about 50,000 and 60,000 years ago, likely in the Middle East, a natural corridor where expanding sapiens populations would have first encountered Neanderthal territory before continuing further into Europe and Asia. That inheritance is not evenly spread. East Asian populations, for reasons still being studied, carry a slightly higher percentage of Neanderthal ancestry than European populations do. Then came the Denisovans, and the numbers got stranger still. Populations across Melanesia, particularly in Papua New Guinea, carry as much as 4 to 6% Denisovan DNA, a far larger fraction than the Neanderthal contribution almost anywhere else. That single statistic implies more than one separate interbreeding event, in more than one place, between sapiens and at least 2 other distinct hominin populations, as our species spread eastward across Asia. Some of this inherited DNA turns out to matter enormously. In 2014, researchers led by Emilia Sanchez identified a gene variant called EPS1, which helps the body regulate hemoglobin production at extreme altitude in modern Tibetan populations. Tracing its origin, they found the variant almost certainly came from Denisovans, adapted over tens of thousands of years to conditions like the ones on that same Tibetan plateau where the Denisovan jawbone was later found. Other inherited fragments carry real, measurable consequences today, not always beneficial ones. Researchers have linked specific Neanderthal-derived gene segments to differences in immune response, skin and hair characteristics, and, in a 2020 study led by Hugo Zeeberg and Pabo, to an increased risk of severe illness from certain modern infections, a genetic echo tens of thousands of years old, still quietly shaping outcomes in hospitals today. In 2022, Svana Pabo was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for this body of work, effectively for founding the field of paleogenomics from scratch and using it to prove something no skeleton alone could ever have shown. Neanderthals and Denisovans did not simply vanish from the planet the way a species goes extinct in a museum diagram, a branch pruned clean off the tree. Parts of them kept going, folded directly into the population that replaced them. None of this was technically simple. Ancient DNA degrades into short, damaged fragments over tens of thousands of years, and any sample is almost guaranteed to be contaminated with modern human DNA from the archaeologists, lab technicians, and centuries of handling the bone has already been through. The specimens Pabo's team eventually relied on most heavily came from Vindija Cave in Croatia, chosen specifically because the cool, stable conditions there had preserved genetic material in unusually good condition, letting researchers filter out contamination with enough confidence to trust the results. Refined analysis since then has revealed the Denisovan story is even more tangled than a single interbreeding event. Genetic signals in different Asian and Oceanian populations point to what appear to be at least 2, possibly 3, distinct Denisovan-like populations, genetically separated from each other by tens of thousands of years, contributing DNA independently to different modern groups. What was once introduced as one ghost lineage may actually be several, overlapping and distinct, still not fully disentangled. And the ghosts are not confined to Neanderthals and Denisovans, either. Genetic studies published in the past several years have identified traces of an unidentified, deeply diverged archaic hominin signal in the DNA of some West African populations, a group with no confirmed fossil, no name, no known site, detectable only as a statistical shadow in living people's genomes. It raises an unsettling possibility this film's opening chapter did not even have room to name. There may be a species out there we have not found any bones for at all. So when this chapter says these relatives were absorbed rather than simply erased, it is not a comforting rounding error. It is not really about anyone's individual ancestry test results either. It is a statement about how porous the boundary between distinct human species turn out to be again and again, whenever and wherever two of them ended up sharing the same river valley for long enough. Homo sapiens did not leave Africa just once. Earlier populations reached the eastern Mediterranean at sites like Skul and Kafsa in what is now Israel, over 100,000 years ago, and left evidence of burial and symbolic behavior there. Those early ventures did not last. The population either died out or retreated, leaving no clear genetic trace in anyone alive today. The migration that actually populated the rest of the world came later, and it came for good. Sometime around 60 to 70,000 years ago, a wave of Homo sapiens moved out of Africa and, unlike the earlier attempts, kept going. Genetic evidence suggests every non-African population alive today descends substantially from this single successful dispersal, a detail that puts an almost uncomfortable amount of history on the shoulders of what may have been a relatively small founding group. The route these groups likely followed traced the coastline, moving along the shores of the Arabian Peninsula in South Asia, where fishing, shellfish, and predictable fresh water made survival easier than cutting straight through interior deserts. Coastal migration is efficient, but it is also slow to leave archaeological traces, since rising sea levels since the last ice age have submerged most of the actual campsites these early travelers would have used. Then, roughly 65,000 years ago, something happened that no earlier hominin, not erectus, not the Neanderthals, not the Denisovans, had ever managed. A group of Homo sapiens crossed open ocean water, out of sight of any shore, and landed on Seoul, the combined ancient landmass of Australia and New Guinea. Archaeological sites like Majbib in Australia's Northern Territory have produced stone tools and ground ochre dated to around this window, evidence of a population already established and settling in. There is no surviving boat from that crossing. There could not be what does not last 65,000 years. But the geography leaves no other explanation. Even during the Ice Age, when sea levels dropped and land bridges connected many land masses that are now separated, a stretch of open water at least 60 miles wide still separated the islands of Southeast Asia from Seoul. Somebody built something that could cross it on purpose with other people on board. From there, the expansion did not slow down. Populations pushed into Europe, arriving in territory Neanderthals had already occupied for hundreds of thousands of years. Others moved deeper into Asia, tracking along river systems and grasslands. Eventually, somewhere between roughly 15 and 20,000 years ago, groups crossed Beringia, the exposed land bridge connecting Siberia to Alaska during the last glacial maximum, into a hemisphere that had never held a single hominin before. Sites like Monte Verde in Chile, dated to roughly 14,500 years ago, show that within just a few thousand years of that first crossing, human populations had already traveled the length of 2 entire continents, reaching nearly the southern tip of South America. No mammal of comparable size in the entire history of this planet has ever colonized this much territory this quickly. It is worth remembering, given everything covered in the last chapter about the Toba bottleneck, how small these founding populations may actually have been at each of these frontiers. Genetic estimates for the founding groups that crossed into Seoul or later into the Americas sometimes run into the low thousands, occasionally lower. A handful of families walking or paddling in a land that had never held anyone like them carried an entire hemisphere's future population inside a genetically tiny starting group. Genetic studies tracking mitochondrial DNA inherited only through the maternal line and Y chromosome DNA inherited only through the paternal line both point toward the same broad conclusion independently, that non-African populations descend from a relatively narrow set of founding lineages that split off from African populations in this general window. The two separate genetic threads agreeing with each other, despite tracing completely different inheritance paths, is part of why researchers trust this reconstruction as much as they do. Earlier, smaller-scale ventures out of Africa left their own faint traces along the way. At Al-Wasta, in what is now the Nefu Desert of Saudi Arabia, researchers found a single human finger bone dated to roughly 85,000 years old, evidence of a population that reached the Arabian Peninsula during a wetter climate period, when the region held lakes and grassland instead of sand. Like the skull and Kafsa populations, this venture appears to have been a dead end too, leaving no confirmed genetic descendants among people alive today. Further along the coastal route, a site called Jwalapuram in southern India preserves stone tools and soil layers directly above and below a thick band of ash from the Toba eruption covered 2 chapters ago, offering rare direct evidence that human populations were already present along this specific migration corridor before the supervolcano went off, and that at least some of them appear to have continued making tools in the same style immediately afterward. As these populations spread into radically different climates, cold northern winters, high-altitude plateaus, intense equatorial sun, their bodies began adapting to, slowly, generation by generation. Skin pigmentation shifted toward tones better suited to the amount of ultraviolet light in each region. body proportions adjusted, on average, towards stockier builds in colder climates and leaner, longer-limbed builds near the equator, the same basic physical rules that shape body heat regulation in mammals generally, now playing out across an entire newly scattered species. The most likely candidates for the last Neanderthal populations on Earth held on in isolated pockets of Iberia, in places like Gibraltar, where a site called Gorham's Cave has produced some of the latest confirmed Neanderthal material anywhere. The dating on the very final sites is still argued over, refined and re-refined as techniques improve, but the broad picture is not in serious dispute. By around 40,000 years ago, after roughly 400,000 years of continuous presence across Eurasia, Neanderthals were gone. That collapse happened within a few thousand years of sustained overlap, with expanding Homo sapiens populations moving across the same territory. A species that had weathered repeated ice ages, that hunted mammoths at close range, that cared for its blind and disabled elders for years at a stretch, did not survive contact with us for very long at all. The question of why sits at the center of one of the most contested debates in the entire field. Direct violence is the explanation people reach for first, and there's at least some physical evidence to point to. A Neanderthal skeleton from Saint-Césaire in France shows a healed skull wound consistent with a sharp weapon strike. But evidence like this is rare, isolated, and impossible to generalize into proof of anything like organized, sustained warfare between the two populations across an entire continent. One wound is not a genocide. It is one wound. Disease offers a quieter, less dramatic mechanism, and in some ways a more plausible one. Two populations that had been evolutionarily separated for hundreds of thousands of years would have carried very different immune histories. A pathogen relatively mild in an incoming sapiens population, one their immune systems had encountered and adapted to over generations, could have moved through an immunologically unprepared Neanderthal population with devastating, silent efficiency, leaving almost no trace for archaeology to find. Climate adds another layer of pressure to the timing. This window overlaps with a documented period of severe cold and environmental instability in Europe, sometimes referred to by researchers as Heinrich Event 4, which would have stressed food supplies and habitat for any large mammal population, Neanderthal or otherwise, already stretched thin by competition for the same hunting grounds. And then there is competitive replacement, the theory that gets the least dramatic headlines, but may carry the most explanatory weight. Homo sapiens arrived with broader social networks spanning larger territories, a wider and more varied diet, and increasingly sophisticated projectile weapons, allowing kills from a distance instead of the close-range confrontation Neanderthal hunting required. None of that needed to involve a single act of violence. It only needed a slight, sustained edge in survival odds, repeated across thousands of years and thousands of individual lives. Layer the interbreeding covered in the last chapter on top of all of this, and the picture gets even less clean. In some regions, small Neanderthal populations may have been demographically swamped, absorbed into a much larger incoming sapiens gene pool simply by weight of numbers, generation after generation of mixed descendants gradually identifying, culturally and genetically, as sapiens rather than as something distinct. This chapter is not going to pick one explanation and present it as the answer, because the honest scientific position is that these forces were probably not competing alternatives at all. Violence in one valley, disease in another, climate stress everywhere, slow demographic absorption running underneath all of it at different speeds in different regions for reasons specific to each local population's exact circumstances. One more piece of evidence complicates any simple story of a healthy population wiped out by a single external cause. In 2014, geneticist K. Prufer's team sequenced the genome of a Neanderthal from Siberia's Altai Mountains and found striking signs of inbreeding, long stretches of genetically identical material inherited from both parents, the kind of pattern seen in small, isolated populations with limited mates to choose from. Some Neanderthal groups may have already been genetically fragile, contracting in number, before Homo sapiens ever arrived in the region at all. That detail does not erase the uncomfortable questions this chapter has raised. It complicates them in a more honest direction. Perhaps this was never a single dramatic confrontation between two evenly matched populations, but a slow squeeze on an already struggling species, arriving from multiple directions at once, climate stress and shrinking numbers on one side, a newly arrived and rapidly expanding competitor on the other, with no single moment anyone could point to and call the cause. Every one of us carrying Neanderthal DNA today is, in a strange sense, both the outcome of that encounter and living proof of it. The interbreeding covered in the last chapter and the extinction covered in this one were not sequential events with a clean line between them. They were very likely the same set of encounters in the same valleys, seen from two different angles, love and loss occurring between the same two populations, sometimes within the very same generation. Look at almost any continent or large island on Earth and ask a simple question. When did the biggest animals that ever lived there disappear? In case after case, on landmass after landmass, the answer lines up with a suspicious, consistent precision. Shortly after Homo sapiens showed up. Australia offers the starkest case. Before humans arrived, the continent was home to Diprotodon, a wombat relative the size of a car, giant short-faced kangaroos standing over 6 feet tall, and Thylacoleo, a marsupial predator sometimes called the marsupial lion. Within a window closely tracking human arrival, estimated at somewhere around 65 to 45,000 years ago, essentially all of Australia's largest land animals were gone. The Americas tell a similar story on a longer delay, matching the later timing of human arrival there. Woolly mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths the size of elephants, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, an entire cast of enormous Ice Age mammals vanished within roughly 2,000 years of humans crossing into the continent, somewhere around 13 to 10,000 years ago. Paleontologists sometimes call this compressed, die-off-Pleistocene overkill, a name that does not hide its implication. Islands make the pattern even sharper because they arrive on a much shorter, much more recent timescale, well within range of careful dating. New Zealand's moa, a family of enormous flightless birds, some standing over 10 feet tall, thrived for millions of years with no land predators at all. Within roughly a century of Maori arrival around the year 1280, every species of moa was extinct. Madagascar tells nearly the same story on a slightly longer clock. Giant lemurs the size of gorillas and elephant birds, so large their eggs held roughly 2 gallons of liquid, survived on that island for millions of years in isolation, then disappeared within the last 1 to 2,000 years, closely tracking the timeline of human settlement there. None of this is a clean, single-cause story, and the field is careful about saying so. Climate change was shifting habitats and food availability on most of these continents during roughly the same windows, and untangling how much of each extinction to credit to hunting pressure versus a warming, changing world is a real and ongoing scientific argument, not a settled fact. But climate change does not explain the timing pattern by itself, and this is the detail that keeps the overkill hypothesis alive in serious research. Climate shifted on its own schedule, largely independent of when humans happened to arrive on a given landmass. The extinctions, again and again, line up not with the climate schedule, but with humanity's arrival schedule, whether that arrival came 45,000 years ago or 1,200 years ago. A coincidence that consistent, repeated on that many separate continents and islands, stops looking like coincidence. Naive large animals, evolved with no experience of a coordinated, tool-using, long-range predator, would have been catastrophically easy prey for a species that had already spent hundreds of thousands of years refining exactly that skill set. It likely did not take deliberate, planned annihilation. It took a slight, sustained hunting pressure on animals that reproduced slowly and had never needed to be afraid of anything walking on 2 legs. Direct kill evidence exists too, not just correlation. At the Manus site in Washington state, researchers recovered a mastodon rib with a bone projectile point embedded directly inside it. The wound partially healed over, dated to roughly 13,800 years ago, physical proof that humans were hunting these massive animals, and that at least some targets survived the initial encounter before eventually dying, likely at human hands, sometime later. Isolation could buy a species real extra time, and the numbers involved are almost eerie. Woolly mammoths survived on Wrangel Island, off the Siberian coast, until roughly 4,000 years ago, thousands of years after mainland populations had already disappeared, in a population that current genetic research suggests had grown small enough to accumulate serious harmful mutations from generations of inbreeding. A species possibly finishing itself off through genetic decline as much as through any renewed human pressure. Egyptian pyramids were already standing while mammoths were still somewhere alive. Some researchers refer to this lingering absence as ecological ghost adaptation. Plants and landscapes still carrying evolutionary features shaped by animals that vanished many thousands of years ago, waiting for a partner that is never coming back. The avocado, oddly enough, is a commonly cited modern example. Its oversized seed almost certainly evolved to pass through the digestive tract of a giant ground sloth or similarly massive extinct mammal, a fruit still built for a mouth that no longer exists anywhere on the planet. Around 12,000 years ago, in the Fertile Crescent, a region spanning parts of what is now Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, human populations began deliberately cultivating wild grasses, wheat and barley, and domesticating sheep and goats. It is one of the most celebrated turning points in the standard telling of human history, the moment civilization supposedly begins. The skeletons buried during this transition tell a considerably less flattering story. Bioarchaeologists studying skeletal remains from before and after the shift to farming in region after region keep finding the same pattern. Early farmers were measurably shorter than the hunter-gatherers who came before them in the same area, a change consistent with chronic nutritional stress during childhood. Average adult height in parts of the eastern Mediterranean actually dropped by several centimeters in the millennia following the adoption of agriculture, and did not fully recover until relatively recent history. Teeth tell a similarly blunt story. Hunter-gatherer skeletons generally show low rates of cavities, since a varied wild diet of meat, tubers, nuts, and fruit does not feed the specific bacteria that erode enamel. Early farming populations, living on starch-heavy, carbohydrate-dense grain, show a sharp jump in dental disease, abscesses, and tooth loss, visible directly in the jaw of anyone excavated from this period. Infectious disease found new and devastating opportunity in the same transition. Living in permanent settlements, in close daily proximity to domesticated animals, opened direct channels for pathogens to jump species. Measles is closely related to a cattle virus. Influenza strains trace back through pigs and birds. Concentrated, settled populations, unlike small mobile foraging bands who could simply leave a contaminated area behind, gave these new diseases exactly the density of hosts they needed to take hold and spread. Farming did produce one undeniable advantage, and it explains almost everything that follows. A stored grain surplus, unlike forage food that has to be found fresh, meant more reliable calories, and reliable calories meant women could wean children earlier and have subsequent pregnancies sooner. Farming populations, despite being individually less healthy, grew faster than foraging populations simply because they could have more children more often. That single fact is the trap, and it is worth being precise about the mechanism. It was never really a considered choice between two lifestyles, weighed and selected on quality of life. It was a one-way ratchet. Once a population's growth rate had already climbed to match its new farmed food supply, retreating back to a smaller, more mobile foraging existence was no longer mathematically possible without a population collapse that no group was going to choose voluntarily. The biologist and author Jared Diamond has called agriculture the worst mistake in the history of the human race, a deliberately provocative phrase, and not every researcher in the field agrees with the framing. But the underlying evidence he is pointing at is not really in dispute. Individual human bodies, on average, appear to have gotten shorter, sicker, and more disease-burdened in the millennia immediately following the adoption of farming, even as the total human population began its long climb toward the billions. One of the clearest case studies comes from Dixon Mounds in Illinois, where researchers including George Armalagos compared skeletons spanning the local population's gradual shift toward intensive maize farming. The pattern was stark. Average height dropped, signs of iron deficiency anemia climbed sharply, infectious disease markers on the bone increased, and life expectancy at birth appears to have fallen, all tracking closely with the increasing reliance on a single, starch-heavy staple crop in place of a more varied older diet. Domestication itself did not arrive all at once, either. Dogs appear to have been domesticated earliest, likely more than 15,000 years ago, well before farming existed at all. Sheep and goats followed around 10,500 years ago, with cattle and pigs close behind, each domestication event adding a new source of zoonotic disease exposure on top of the last, layered gradually into daily human life over several thousand years rather than arriving as one clean, single transition. The physical labor burden of farming did not fall evenly, either. A 2017 study led by Alison McIntosh, examining leg bone strength in prehistoric agricultural women across several thousand years of Central European farming communities, found bone density and strength patterns comparable to, and in some cases exceeding, those of modern elite female rowing athletes, evidence of sustained, grinding physical labor, grinding grain, tending fields, carrying water, that shaped women's bodies as dramatically as any deliberate athletic training program does today. None of this means the hunter-gatherers who came before were living some effortless paradise either. Life before farming carried its own dangers, unpredictable food supply chief among them, and this chapter is not arguing for a return to some imagined golden age. It is arguing for something narrower and harder to dismiss, that the story of agriculture as pure, uncomplicated human progress does not survive contact with the actual skeletons left behind by the people who lived through it first. The oldest confirmed defensive wall on Earth stands at Jericho in the Jordan Valley, raised roughly 11,000 years ago alongside a massive stone tower, built before pottery, before writing, before almost any of the technology usually associated with civilization. Archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon uncovered it decades ago, and the implication has only gotten harder to avoid since. Humans built serious defensive architecture against other humans before they built almost anything else. That defensive instinct was not paranoia without cause. At Nadaruk, in Kenya, researchers found the remains of at least 27 individuals, dated to roughly 10,000 years ago, showing blunt force trauma, arrow wounds, and in several cases, bindings, all consistent with a coordinated, violent attack rather than isolated accidents. A similar mass grave at Talheim, in Germany, dated somewhat later, shows an entire community, men, women, and children, killed together and buried in a single pit. Organized violence at this scale requires something forgers rarely needed, a reason worth killing an entire community over. Stored grain, claimed farmland, and controlled water access gave settled populations, for the first time, fixed, defensible, stealable resources. Warfare did not require agriculture to exist in some form, but agriculture appears to have given it a scale and a motive it had rarely had before. Stratification followed the same logic, and it shows up early in the archaeological record, visible in something as simple as who got buried with what. Graves from early farming settlements increasingly show sharp differences in the wealth and status of their occupants, some burials accompanied by elaborate goods, ornaments, and clear signs of prestige, others nearly empty. In populations where earlier foraging burials tend to look far more similar to each other regardless of who is in the ground. Slavery enters the written record almost as soon as writing itself does. Sumerian cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia, some dating back over 4,000 years, include detailed inventories that list enslaved people alongside livestock and grain, itemized as property, bought, sold, and inherited. This is not a later corruption of some earlier, purer civilization. It is present at essentially the earliest point at which any civilization left records detailed enough to check. And writing itself, so often framed as humanity's great leap into abstract, poetic thought, was overwhelmingly invented for a far less romantic purpose. The earliest known writing systems, emerging from simple clay tokens and impressed accounting marks in Uruk, in Mesopotamia, around 5,000 years ago, exist almost entirely to track grain shipments, temple inventories, tax obligations, and debts. Poetry came later. The ledger came first. Trace the line all the way through, and it runs remarkably straight. A stored surplus from the previous chapter needed a granary. A granary worth stealing needed a wall. A wall needed defenders, and defenders needed someone in charge of deciding who defended what, and who got paid for it, and who did not. Hierarchy, in other words, is not a late-stage corruption that crept into some earlier, more innocent version of civilization. It is one of civilization's founding features, present from essentially the first brick. It is worth being fair to the counter-evidence here, too, because hierarchy was not universal or automatic everywhere farming took hold. At Catalhoyuk, in central Turkey, a densely packed settlement of roughly 8,000 people occupied continuously from around 9,400 years ago, archaeologists have found strikingly little evidence of separate elite housing, central palaces, or obvious status differences between homes. For at least this one large community, farming and density did not automatically produce a ruling class. But Catalhoyuk turned out to be closer to an exception than a rule, and the broader Mesopotamian pattern that followed it went the other direction decisively. By around 4,300 years ago, the Code of Ur-Nammu, one of the oldest surviving legal codes, was already codifying rules around enslaved people as a distinct, legally regulated category of property, spelling out penalties for their injury or loss in the same structural language used to cover livestock and land. Visual art from this same era makes the new social order impossible to miss. The standard of Ur, an inlaid wooden box roughly 4,500 years old, depicts one panel of soldiers marching captives before a seated ruler, and a second panel of that same ruler presiding over a lavish banquet, feasted by others while bound prisoners stand nearby. Whoever commissioned it wanted no ambiguity about who now sat at the top of this new arrangement and who did not. This is the species that walked out of Africa a few chapters ago, the same one that may have absorbed or ended its closest cousins, the same one whose arrival on nearly every continent lines up with the silence left behind by entire categories of large animal. Now watch it turn that same relentless, adaptive drive inward, building walls, ledgers, and chains around itself for itself. It is tempting after 19 chapters of deep time to assume evolution is something that happened to earlier, less finished versions of us, and stopped once modern humans showed up. That assumption is simply wrong. Evolution does not know when a documentary about it is supposed to end. It is kept running quietly inside recorded history, well within the time frame of written language and named kings. Take lactase persistence, the ability to digest milk sugar comfortably into adulthood. Most mammals, including most humans historically, lose that ability after weaning. But in populations with a long history of dairy farming, a genetic mutation allowing lifelong lactose digestion spread rapidly. Within roughly the last 7 to 10,000 years, one of the fastest documented cases of a single gene variant sweeping through a human population. High-altitude adaptation offers an even sharper example, and it circles directly back to a thread from earlier in this film. Tibetan populations carry that Denisovan-derived EPS1 variant covered several chapters ago, regulating blood oxygen at extreme elevation. Andean populations in South America, facing similar thin air thousands of miles away, evolved a completely different biological solution to the identical problem, arriving at comparable results through entirely separate genetic paths. Disease has shaped us just as recently and just as measurably. The sickle cell trait, which causes serious illness in its full form, provides significant resistance to malaria in populations from regions where that disease has been a major killer for millennia, a brutal trade the human genome made without anyone choosing it. A separate mutation, called CCR5 Delta 32, appears to have spread through parts of northern Europe partly in response to historical epidemic disease, and today provides some natural resistance to HIV infection in people who carry two copies. None of that evolution required intention. It happened the way it always has, through death, survival, and reproduction, filtered blindly across generations by whatever pressures happen to be present. What is genuinely new, and what closes this film, is a species that has started trying to run that same process on purpose, on a timeline measured in years instead of millennia. In 2012, Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier published the foundational work on CRISPR-Cas9, a tool that lets researchers edit specific sequences of DNA with a precision that would have sounded like science fiction to any geneticist working even a decade earlier. They share the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for it in 2020. The tool did exactly what it promised. It let humans rewrite the genetic code of living organisms deliberately, letter by letter. In 2018, a Chinese researcher named He Jinkui announced he had used that tool to edit the genomes of twin embryos, attempting to disable the same CCR5 gene connected to HIV resistance, before those embryos were carried to term and born. The global scientific community reacted with near universal condemnation, citing enormous unresolved safety risks and the absence of any real ethical or regulatory framework. He was later sentenced to prison in China. The line had been crossed anyway, publicly, irreversibly, by one person, one lab, one decision. Embryo screening technology has continued advancing since, quieter and less dramatic than headline-grabbing gene editing, but arguably just as consequential, allowing prospective parents to select among embryos based on predicted genetic traits before implantation even occurs. None of this is evolution in the old sense anymore. Blind mutation tested slowly against a harsh environment. This is a species reaching directly into its own genetic future and starting to make choices its ancestors never had the tools or the audacity to make. Go back for a moment to where this film started. One surviving human species out of at least 9 that once shared this planet. Every one of those other 8 branches disappeared for essentially the same underlying reason, whatever the specific mechanism turned out to be in each case. Something in their environment changed faster than their biology could keep up with. This species is now the only one on Earth capable of changing that equation on purpose, accelerating its own rate of biological change deliberately, instead of waiting for circumstance to force the issue the way it forced it on Neanderthals, on Denisovans, on the small island-dwelling relatives who never left Flores. Whether that capability turns out to be the thing that finally lets this branch escape the pattern, or simply a faster, more sophisticated version of the same pattern, is not a question this film can answer. There is a strange, almost circular detail worth sitting with before this film ends. Research teams are now using CRISPR gene editing, the same technology covered a few scenes ago, in active attempts to revive traits from the woolly mammoth, splicing cold-adapted genes into the genome of the Asian elephant, its closest living relative, in the hope of eventually producing something close to a living approximation of an animal this species very likely helped hunt into extinction roughly 10,000 years ago. Whether that project succeeds, and whether it should even be attempted, are both open questions the scientists involved argue about as fiercely as anyone else in this field. But the symmetry is hard to ignore. The same species that ended one era of megafauna through nothing more sophisticated than persistence and a sharpened point is now reaching for the most sophisticated tool it has ever built and pointing it, at least in part, back at the wound it left behind. Aging itself has become a target of the same impulse. Researchers across multiple fields are now studying the genetic and cellular mechanisms behind why human bodies deteriorate over time at all, treating aging less as an unavoidable fact of biology and more as a specific, describable process that might eventually be slowed, adjusted, or in some framings, treated as a condition rather than a certainty. Whether that ambition is realistic on any near-term timescale remains deeply contested. That serious researchers are pursuing it at all marks a real shift in how this species now thinks about its own limits. None of this required anyone's permission in any global sense. There is no committee representing the entire species that approved CRISPR or embryo screening or the attempt to rebuild a mammoth. A handful of labs, a handful of countries, a handful of individual decisions are currently setting the terms for changes that will ripple through every human population on Earth, the same way one small founding group's decision to cross open ocean once determined who would eventually populate an entire continent. It is, in the end, the only question that ever mattered here. Somewhere right now, a species that spent 7 million years being shaped by a world it could not control has started shaping itself instead. Nobody currently alive is going to be around to see how that particular story ends.